o'clock, and that is answering questions. Right? Any question about philosophy, uh, religion, spirituality, the scriptures, morality, anything along those lines, anything that is tangentially related to religion. It's not just limited to religious questions, but also philosophical questions. Because what we're doing is we're seeking and searching for truth, right? Just truth. I believe that all truth comes from God, and wherever there is truth, it exists because God has created. God is truth, and in creating everything, where there is truth, that is an echo, so to speak, of God. Uh, so, with that, do you have any questions?
Just one, but it might be short.
That's fine.
Are there jokes in the Bible?
Jokes. Yes, there are. There are jokes in the Bible. One of the more commonly known jokes, actually, I think, is over. Maybe joke is a bad word. Humor.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Humor is in the Bible.
Like plays on words and
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. There's not like a knock joke or anything.
Yeah.
Maybe there is. I haven't found it yet. It seems to be a distinctly American thing. Knock. But Jesus does talk about knocking on the door, so maybe I don't know. Anyway. No, but there are humorous situations. There are things in the Bible that are funny, like in Matthew chapter 7. Most famously known for when Jesus says, "Don't judge or you'll be judged." Right? He uses the picture. He says you're trying to get the speck, like a piece of dust or sawdust, out of somebody's eye, but you have a beam coming out of your own. So if you can imagine somebody walking with like a 4x4 coming out of their face, right? Walking up to somebody and saying, "Hey, let me get that little thing. You've got something," right? Why they've got this, coming out of their head. That's funny. And there are a lot of things like that are funny. But as far as there being like a joke, where somebody tells a joke and other people don't, guess it and it's funny and they all laugh, I don't know if that is present so much. But there are humorous and funny things.
Yeah, I just meant more like a play on words.
Yeah. Wordplay happens a lot, in particular in the Old Testament. Hebrew poetry especially likes wordplay. And so there's a lot of things like that. Like the prophet Isaiah, one of the things that the prophet Isaiah will say, line upon line, in the prophet Isaiah, it actually sounds like a baby babbling. And so when Isaiah says that, he's kind of making fun of the people saying that your religion is childish. It's like a baby. And so there's a lot of things like that. The Bible plays with words a lot. We just don't always notice it in English because it wasn't written in English, and so not everything translates. Like there are jokes in English that aren't very funny to somebody who speaks another language. And there are idioms especially. I ask Mom all the time for Spanish idioms. There are idioms, like figures of speech, that make sense in one language, but they don't really translate over into another. So there's lots of things that we just don't see because we're not native Hebrew speakers or Greek speakers. Yeah. So that would be the answer to that question is yes. Humor is all throughout the Bible. God is very funny.
Well, I just noticed the Bible uses a lot of literary tools, but I didn't know if that was one of them.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about the Bible is you can study it as literature because all the elements of a good book are present in the Bible.
Like the characters who foreshadow Jesus.
Yeah, there's foreshadowing, there's suspense, there's irony, there's humor. All the things that make good writing are in the Bible because that's what it is. First and foremost, it is a written work. Mm-hmm. And the way that you communicate well doesn't change. It doesn't matter whether you're writing a play or a poem or the Bible, which incidentally has both of those things in it.
It has plays?
Yeah, there's plays in the Bible.
Cool.
Yeah, the Song of Solomon actually is written a lot like an ancient play, where you have a chorus and you have one or two or three main characters. You have the woman, her beloved, and then there seems like there's a third guy talking to her, trying to maybe whether the beloved and anyway. It depends on who you ask. How many characters there are, but it's set up very much like an ancient play. And so there are plays, there's poetry, there's prose, there are epic poems. The Book of Job is an epic poem, just a long poem. And so it has all these different types of writing in it. And you should expect all of the same elements in the Bible that you notice in other writing that's good. Because the Bible first is written communication. And the reason why you see certain elements in like a very famous play is because it communicated to you. And the things that communicate, the same tools will work, right? And so we should expect to see the same thing.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's why you noticed humor. Is because humor is very effective. You can correct people more easily with humor than you can by yelling at them. And so Jesus in Matthew 7, is using humor. You've got this board coming out of your face, and you're trying to get a speck out of somebody's eye. It's funny. Any other questions that you had? And by the way, if you're watching, if you've joined us, and you have a question, please feel free, again, at any time to send in questions relating to truth. Maybe that's how we should phrase it. It can be about the scriptures. It can be about religion specifically. It can be about philosophy, morality, a logical question, maybe not like a logical puzzle, but like just working through with logic, because we're interested in truth. If we are seeking to know more about God, then we are seeking to know truth, because God is truth. And so whatever we find that is true, it will lead us to God or be from God, one of the two. Okay, so one of the questions that I got, that I get a lot, and we will not be able to answer it completely tonight. So if you're watching and you have questions about this, go ahead and ask any clarifying questions that you might have, with the caveat that we are not going to be able to cover the question in its entirety tonight. And I'm not going to give a bunch of obscure references that people won't be able to find. I can find those if you're really interested in the question. But it was about the inspiration of the Bible and what is inspiration is one of the questions, but the other is every word inspired?
Like the entire...
Yeah,
all of the
from
writings?
beginning to end. And we have to kind of clarify what we mean there, because my answer to that question is yes, it's all inspired. But that's not a good enough answer.
Because some of the characters say things that you wouldn't say. Like, when they're lying to other people, Surely they weren't inspired.
Right, so that gets to why this is such a broad question, because you can ask that question, is the Bible inspired? And I would say, yeah, sure. But what do you mean by inspired? Do you mean that God dictated every single word of the text? That everything that is written down is there because God told whoever was writing it, pick this word? Is that how it worked? And if that's how it worked, like, let's just pretend for a second that that's how it worked. That when the Apostle Paul sits down and he's going to write a letter to somebody, any of the letters that he wrote, even some of the letters he wrote that we don't have, right? So he's going to sit down and he's going to write a letter to somebody, to the Romans, and he starts writing, and God comes and like pokes him in the head and says, Paul, you need to say this. And Paul goes, oh, okay. And so it's almost like God is dictating and Paul is a secretary, or the technical word would be amanuensis, right? He writes down exactly what somebody else says. And that's compounded by the fact that Paul probably didn't write the letters himself.
But isn't there one part where Paul specifically says that it was his footnote or whatever? Like, he puts in a comment and he says, "This is just my opinion."
Yes. Yeah, we're gonna get to that, right?
Okay.
So,
sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? And it is very appropriate to the discussion. But that's one idea, is that when Paul sat down to dictate, God kind of spoke to Paul, and then Paul, however that worked, and Paul dictated a letter, and somebody else recorded it, and they wrote down exactly word for word, not only word for word, but tense for tense. Everything, all the mood, the tense, the number, everything.
So God picked the exact way it's written.
Yes. And even the structure of the sentences. And in inflected languages, you're studying Latin, you know this, right? In inflected languages, you can move the words around some, and it doesn't really change the meaning of what you say, right? Because it's the words are inflected, so the word order is less important than in an uninflected language like English. Right, the word order in English is pretty important.
Yeah.
You start moving words around and you change, you can really mess up a sentence.
You don't want to sound like Yoda.
Right. But that's not absolutely true, right? So with inflected languages, there is some times where the word order matters. And so is that how that worked? Or is there some other way? And when we say some other way, we mean just not that.
So, like, did God just give them the general idea of what to write, maybe?
Yeah, they use their own vocabulary to express the idea, and the idea is expressed correctly, right? Truly, the idea is expressed. Even though maybe God didn't pick the words specifically, yeah.
So how can we tell?
That's a good question, right? And that's what we'll do in just a minute. If, before we get to that, right, you've got 2 good points so far. Don't let me forget what they were. Before we do that, you have to ask, okay, let's pretend for the sake of argument that is what happened, that God told Paul exactly what to say,
Okay.
and Paul said it, and then whoever was recorded it exactly.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't mess up. They didn't shorthand. Precisely. The question then is...
I didn't even think about that. What if they made a mistake?
Right, or because the word order doesn't matter, what if they change the word order some, and they're like, it's the same.
Anyway, sorry.
So that, we're going to assume that that's the case. Then the question is, how do we know that we have today exactly what Paul said, and that through the centuries of copying...
And translating.
Right, well, we're just going to stick with copying, right? We're not even going to get into translating yet, because copying is easier. So in the centuries of copying, there's no changes, right? That everything is preserved exactly the way that it was, which would have to be the case in order to say that when you pick up a Bible, you have the precise words, and not even an English Bible, but a Greek New Testament.
So if at any point between when God would have told them what to say and then all the people who've written it down since, if they made a mistake, then it wouldn't be the same, right?
Well, and that's important, because there's not just like 15 documents and they span the centuries, right? There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of documents.
So you can tell which ones...
You can tell when changes happen.
Okay.
By and large, right? Like you can compare things and you can see when stuff changes throughout time and history. And textual critics do that. Like they have all these different documents, books, papyri, and they look at papyri, yeah, pieces of papyrus.
Okay.
Which is just ancient paper, right?
That sounds cooler than papyri.
Well, it's a very specific type of paper, right? And Egyptians, I think, are the ones who invented that. They take the papyrus reeds and mash it into a paper that rolls.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. And that was cheap paper. Expensive paper was actually animal skin.
Wow. Called
vellum, which is just really thin sheets of leather that you make paper out of. You kind of roll it out anyway. Yeah. Not a lesson on how to make paper, so we're done with that. But they have all these different documents, and they can look at them and they can say, well, there's an error here, or there's a change in this one. And so they can kind of, go back through time and see when changes have happened. Now, there are enough changes that we have a hard time saying with absolute certainty that when you look at a copy of the Greek text today, it is precisely the same
as what Paul
would have written. Now, having said that, it's like 99.99% we can be sure that it's precisely the same.
That's pretty accurate.
Because of the mountain of evidence that we have and all the comparisons that you can make. And so, you can be pretty sure that it's fairly close, right? As at least up until the very first documents that we have that are still in existence, which come from like the end of the 1st century.
So we don't have like the very first letter.
Right, we don't have the very first letters, and one of the reasons why is because papyrus falls apart. Right, and the documents that we do have tends to come from dry regions, like Egypt or Jerusalem, places where it's dry. Because when you get into most of Greece, they have a more temperate climate, and that destroys papyrus. And it doesn't last for very long.
The humidity?
Yeah, it just doesn't last for very long. It falls apart. And since papyrus is cheap, and Christians were persecuted, lots of the early writings would have been on things like papyrus. Right, and so we just don't have like an abundance of writings from the 1st century. We do not have the original manuscripts. We don't have those. but we have things that are very close to it. And now, when you think about ancient documents, that's significant because we don't have the manuscripts for almost everything. Right? We don't have any of the manuscripts for Caesar's writings. We don't have any of the manuscripts for Homer's writings, for all these other ancient authors.
What about Shakespeare?
Well, Shakespeare wrote at a different time, and the printing press was already invented.
Oh, okay.
But now, interestingly enough, bringing up Shakespeare, even in Shakespeare, writing in the 1600s, there are variations in Shakespeare's play.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just thinking, I had to read one of them for school a while back, and then the two different versions that we read, mine was different from everybody else's because I was using, I got the wrong copy, and it wasn't the same as my other classmates.
Yeah, there are variations in the plays. One of the most significant variations is that one of the earliest printings of Shakespeare's works was it's called a folio, which you have these big pieces of paper and you fold them in half. But all right, we're done with that. We keep getting into paper making. The soliloquy, Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, is missing from one of the versions of the play.
Huh.
That's a pretty significant difference.
Uh-huh.
Right? It's like the most famous thing
that Shakespeare
ever wrote. And it's missing from one of the copies of the play. And it's not like, the page fell out. It's not there. It just goes from where that ought to be to the next thing. And you're like, well, that's weird. So even after the printing press is around, there are big things like that happen. Right? So there's so putting that kind of in perspective with the Bible, that we have more evidence for the Bible than we have for any other ancient piece of literature.
Even Shakespeare.
Yeah. I mean, Shakespeare, there is kind of in the same ballpark with you can't be absolutely sure. In fact, people have written, doctoral theses over questions like that. Is it supposed to be there, or is it a later addition? And I think they've roundly come to the conclusion that it's supposed to be there.
I like it, so I hope so.
Even if for no other reason, then it's the best thing he ever wrote. We're going to give him credit. Right? So, that's kind of where we are with the idea of inspiration. Is not only would it have to be word for word in Paul's mouth when he spoke it, it would have to be recorded word for word perfectly, but then it would have to be preserved word for word perfectly. And the reality of the situation is that it's just not very practical.
That would be exactly what he wrote.
That would happen.
So some of the words might be different, like maybe minor words like, and, but, and, or.
Yes. And to complicate that, not only do you have to do that with the New Testament, but you also have to do the same thing with the Old Testament.
Oh, which is older.
Right.
Hence
and there are different versions of the Old Testament. There are at least 3 different Hebrew versions.
So the rabbis would have taught differently.
Right. But again, the differences aren't too significant. And there is the Septuagint.
Which is Greek, right?
Which is Greek. And so when you go back to the Old Testament, then you even have to ask the question, which version of the Old Testament is the right one? And thankfully, there aren't that many differences, right? Maybe there's only 2 main Hebrew translations, Hebrew versions. And the biggest difference, one of the biggest differences is the prophet Jeremiah. There are some pretty significant differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint in Jeremiah. I mean, big differences.
So are those the 2 most popular Old Testament versions?
Yeah, those are the 2 most common, is the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. And so, when you start asking this question, did God give us every word? It's a really complicated question. And we have to be realistic with how we try and answer it. And we can't just say, oh, well, God could do it, so therefore he did. Yeah, nobody's questioning whether he could. Mm-hmm. The question is whether he did. And whether it's necessary. Because again, if we're seeking truth can be conveyed with different words. The same truth can be conveyed with different words. And so, to your point that you brought up earlier.
Which one?
The one about 1 Corinthians.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Where Paul is actually going to say, let's see if we can get this. It's in 1 Corinthians... I think it's in 7. let's see. No. Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 7. So let's switch over to the Bible. Oh, I had it up to our inspiration passage. Right? This is a passage around inspiration. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching. And the question is, what does it mean? Right? It's not debatable. Mm-hmm. Is Scripture breathed out by God? Yes, it says so. Mm-hmm. The question is, what does that mean? Right? And so nobody who is a Bible believer would deny that Scripture is inspired. Right? If you trust that the Bible is from God and you believe that it is God's revelation to mankind, then you cannot deny
that all Scripture is profitable for teaching.
Right? It's breathed out by God and is profitable for teaching. The question isn't whether Scripture is inspired. It is. The question is, what does that mean? What does it mean for Scripture to be inspired?
I have no idea.
That's the difficulty, right? And so if we flip over now, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 25. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 25. And this is the interesting part, right? One of the interesting parts. Concerning the betrothed, I have no commandment from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he just tells you, he just said, God didn't tell me. But what about the people who are engaged? Mm-hmm. God didn't tell me. But I'm going to tell you what I think. So did God stop inspiring Paul at this point?
Or did he add like a note later, maybe?
He didn't add it later, right? It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, because they had to just keep continuously writing.
Right. It's not like a word processor where you can go back and insert. Yeah. So it's all one solid flow of thought flow work. Anyway, stream of consciousness. I don't know. Anyway, it's one thought, right? He just moves through it fluidly. That's what we'll say. And then later, he's actually going to say something very similar, where he's going to say, "Now this is from the Lord," right? And so you have Paul making these distinctions. Here's there we go. Ooh, that was almost bad, right? We have Paul making these distinctions. In my judgment, she's happier assuring as she is, and I think that I have the Spirit of God.
What does that mean?
If you figure that out, you can tell everybody, and people will buy your book.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's like Paul starts off chapter 7 by saying, God didn't tell me, or this section, starting in verse 25, God didn't tell me, but I'm going to tell you what I think. And then he gets to the end, and he gives this piece of advice, and then he says, I think I have the Spirit of God too. And what does that mean? Does it mean that he thinks this last bit is from the Lord, but the first part isn't? And so it should call into question, what do we think we're talking about when we say inspiration? When you have Paul, pretty clearly saying in verse 25, I have no commandment from the Lord, but I give my own judgment. And then later saying, I think I have the Spirit. And so it really forces us to grapple with, what does it mean for the text to be inspired? Does it mean that God has guided the production of the text so that it has his truth? At least that.
Release means that.
Right. Does it mean that God provided, protected, and preserved every single word, every single grammatical inflection? Maybe, but I don't know how you would ever prove that. I don't know that you can, especially when you consider the competing versions of the Old Testament. Competing isn't the right word.
They're varying.
There's different versions of the Old Testament. And all three of them are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have the Greek that's there. You have the two different Hebrew versions that are there. And
so maybe it's just important to read all three and then gather the meaning from that, because each one maybe offers different insights?
Well, they don't contradict as far as the truth is concerned.
Yeah.
Right? So the important thing seems to be the truth. And regardless of whatever view you take of inspiration, I think everybody, again, who is a Bible believer, somebody who thinks that the Bible has come from the Lord, regardless of how they think that process actually occurred, they would agree that it contains truth and that it is the source of truth for what we ought to do. Most people, throughout history, I don't say all because there's always outliers, right? But most people who have claimed to be Christians throughout time, that has been their view. Whether they were Catholic or Greek Orthodox or some other, Coptic or Ethiopian, or eventually what would turn into, all the Protestant churches, whatever. That has been the view of nearly everyone, that the Bible contains truth. And so that's really what we should focus on when we're reading it, is what is the truth that is being conveyed, regardless of whether or not I think every single word was dictated, or if I think just the truth itself is dictated, and I'm using these, Paul or John or Mark or whoever, you chose their own words to convey that truth. So that's kind of the question about the difficulty of talking about inspiration.
I have a question.
Okay.
Do the different authors use different styles?
Yes. Paul writes very differently from Peter. And John is very unique in the way that John writes.
Is it just for the varying audiences, or is it just like the way those people wrote?
It seems to be their personal style. And that's another question. If God is the one dictating everything, how come the style isn't the same? Not that everything that an author writes is always the same, right? Like, an author is capable of varying their personal style. But there are dramatic differences that seem to be consistent with each of the various authors. Like when John writes, it's always John. You can tell.
And Paul always starts his letters the same way.
Paul writes very Pauline, right? It's very much like Paul. You don't read one of Paul's letters and say, is this Peter? I mean, you just know, right? You know who it is. Peter writes very much like a Hebrew. He writes in Greek, or at least his letters are in Greek, but he writes very much like a Hebrew. The author of Hebrews is so starkly different in style to the rest of the Pauline letters that is one of the primary arguments that Paul didn't write Hebrews, is because the style is so different.
Is that why no one knows if he wrote it or not?
Right. And it just doesn't seem like there's information in it that makes it seem like it's not Paul, but somebody who probably knew Paul really well. And so it's difficult, right? But you're right. There are distinct authorial styles that are consistent with it to each of the various writers. And so if God did change God's style, he kept it consistent for Paul and consistent for John and consistent for Peter. And so that would be awkward, right? Or it would be, he could have done it that way, but it just seems like that's not how it worked. It seems like God imparted information, and these human writers used their own language to impart that information. And then that gets us into the translation issue, which you kind of already brought up, right?
Sorry, I didn't mean to get ahead.
No, you're fine. But when you look at the text that we have on the screen, that's not Greek, right? That's just not what Greek looks like.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I've looked before, but I don't think that's Greek. What do I know? Let me see. We can put some Greek up there just so that people, if they're not familiar with it, they can see the differences. That's Greek.
Yikes.
Yeah.
I can't read that.
Yeah, you can.
I can't read much of it.
Huh?
I can't read that.
Sure you can. Anyway, that's what Greek looks like. There's English. I think I have Latin somewhere too. You could read the Latin. I can't read the Latin.
I can read minor bits of Latin.
Yeah, there's the Latin. Yay for the Vulgate. Ooh, that's small. We'll make it bigger. But so the question is, when you start reading through it and you deal with the Latin here, like you said, I can make a little sense of Latin. I just don't know it. Mm-hmm. I'm much more familiar with Greek, and I'm fluent in English.
See, that's the one I speak.
Right. Right. I can study the other ones, but this is my mother tongue. Mm-hmm. And the translation in English is different than the Greek.
So, like, they have different emphasis, or what?
It's the way that you say things is different. That the more literal an English translation gets, the more close to the way that things are in the Greek text, the weirder it becomes for English speakers. That's why one of the reasons why I don't like the New American Standard Bible is it tries to stick and adhere so closely to the word order and the way that the Greek text does things that it sounds awkward to an English speaker.
So it's like the language is I guess, logic different?
The logic of the language is different. The expressions are different. The word order is different, and it's kind of like if you cheated, like a high school or college student, right? If you're taking Spanish class and your professor were to give you this assignment and it's in Spanish and you're supposed to translate it into English, if you go to like translate.google.com and you put that Spanish text in and then you try and move it over into English, your professor will know. Mm-hmm. Because it's going to be goofy. Because the computer is going to do a very rigid and wooden translation. And it's just not the way people talk. So what you're doing when you're translating from one language to another is you're really not doing a word for word movement over into the language. You're doing a thought for thought. Whether you realize you're doing it or not, when you take a sentence in Spanish and you move it over into English, you take the idea, the logic, the structure, the idea in Spanish, and you're moving it over into a language that uses a different logical structure. And so you have to present the idea in different words to get the same meaning. Mm-hmm. So when you move it from Greek over into English, you can't do a word-for-word translation. It just doesn't work that way. So what you have to do is you have to get the idea using the structure, the logic of Greek, move it over into English logic and structure, and then convey the idea. So the idea moves from one language to another.
But not with the same words.
The words used to express the idea will change, right? But the idea stays the same. And so when you get to an English Bible, asking the question, are these the very words that God spoke? No, they're not. Right? They're just not. Even if God spoke Hebrew to the Hebrews, I don't know how that worked, right? Did God speak Hebrew to them? I don't know. As soon as you move from the Hebrew into the English, you no longer have what was originally written. That's just not how translation works. But you have the same ideas, the same truth. And when you move from the Greek into English, you no longer have what was originally written. But you can have the same ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of the difficulty in talking about translations.
Well, it's the same with any other document.
Exactly.
Like when they translate what Caesar's writings of his campaigns and stuff, you're not getting the exact copy of Caesar's writings because that's in Latin.
Right. And C.S. Lewis, actually, dealing with that question, would recommend to his students, don't read what somebody else says about Julius Caesar. Just go read Julius Caesar. Don't read what somebody else translates as Caesar's words. Go read Julius Caesar. Right? That was C.S. Lewis, the advice that he gave to his students. When you can, go read what the author actually wrote. Because the difference sometimes in the two languages can be pretty significant. It's normally not like earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but it does normally give you better insight maybe into what the author was feeling or what they originally meant. And so that's just the difficulty of dealing with translations, is as soon as you move out of one language into another, the best you can do is move an idea.
It's because you lose like emotion and stuff sometimes.
If you don't...
Well, if you do like a literal translation.
Right. But if you take the idea and the feeling in one language, you can put it into another separate language, a new language, but you have to use different words, right? You can't, it's not a one-for-one, right? And that's the difficulty with answering this question. Is the Bible that I have inspired? Well, yes, I think it is, but what do you mean by inspired? Right? And you will run into people who will claim that a certain version of the Bible is inspired, right? In particular, the King James Bible. That tends to be people, you run into them and they're like, no, this is it. He inspired the Bible again, originally in Greek and now in the King James Bible. But interestingly enough, if you go to a bookstore today and you buy a King James Bible, it is not the same King James Bible that was originally written.
Because that was written in Middle English, right?
No, it's modern English, but it's a different style. We would call it Elizabethan.
Yeah.
But in the 17th century, in 1611, they have changed the King James Version. Right? I think the latest revision that you will often see in stores is from 1888, I think. And so it's changed. Right? There are even some, maybe I'm off. Maybe there are even some newer changes. But you do not have, if you go to the bookstore and buy a King James Version, you do not have the King James Bible that was originally translated in in 1611. It's changed. And so the idea that there is an English translation that somehow is divinely inspired and God made it, right? That's just silly. That's not at all what happened.
Because it wasn't written in English.
Right, right. And there is some question as to whether or not the people in the Bible were even speaking Greek. Like when Jesus is speaking to the Jews, it's much more likely that he actually spoke Aramaic to the Hebrew people.
Because that's what they spoke, right?
That's what they spoke. Now, many people would have spoken Greek also. It's like if you go to Europe and you go to Germany, most people in Germany will at least be familiar with English, right? To the point where you could buy something at a shop, or you could ask somebody where the restroom is, or get directions. Because it's a language that people kind of pick up, right? You use it. It's an international language. That would have been true of Greek in the ancient world. Most people probably know it, but it's not their primary language, and they may not be very proficient at it. And when Jesus is in the countryside, speaking to Hebrew people who maybe aren't quite so educated, it's much more likely that he was speaking Aramaic. Like the Sermon on the Mount was probably in Aramaic and not in Greek. Now, can we prove that? No. There's no way to prove it. But we don't have it spoken in Aramaic. We have it written in Greek. And so you're dealing with a translation there. And when you start moving between languages, what is it that moves? It's not the words, it's the idea, right? It's the truth that moves. And so that's the trick when you start talking about translations.
I guess that's why you have like modern books. Like modern novels are translated into multiple languages. Because like I've seen just books that I read in Spanish, German, English, French,
Yep.
A bunch of different languages, but it's still the same book, right?
Exactly. Shakespeare, that's who you've been talking about, because you're reading a lot of Shakespeare. You can read Shakespeare in Spanish. It's the same play, but the words are different, right? And there actually may even be some different emphases because it's in Spanish and it's not in English. And to get the idea across, the one thing that I will tell you that will probably be exactly the same in Julius Caesar will be the Et tu, Brute. that's probably the same. But the idea, moving between languages, you're going to get the same impact, the same truth, the same story. It's just a different language. It doesn't have to be the same language. So that's a really good example.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And that's the difficulty with the Bible. And what we want to do is we feel like we have to defend the Bible. And that's good, right? I mean, we believe that it's come from the Lord. We feel like people are trying to attack it all the time. They are trying to attack it all the time. And we feel like we can't, we're afraid. And when I say we, I mean, these are struggles that I have had, right? Me personally. We're afraid to admit something that somebody else might be able to use for ammunition, right? And so what we have to do, if our interest is really in truth, then we have to be okay with admitting something that's saying, yeah, that's probably right. Even if somebody else can twist it and misuse it, because we're after truth and we're not afraid of truth. And so when we talk about inspiration, it's okay to say that ideas move between languages using different words. And we're not even reading the Bible, right? I don't normally read the Bible in Greek. I prefer the Greek Old Testament, but I typically read it in English. By the very nature of the fact that I am reading the Bible in English, I am not reading what was originally written.
Well, if you preached in Greek, none of us would understand you.
Right. Right. And so you're dealing with that. So right off the bat, is my English Bible exactly what was written or spoken? The answer is no. If you mean word for word. But is the truth the same? Absolutely. Are the ideas the same? Absolutely. Are they very, 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 very close? Like the Greek text that we have today, is it very, very close to what Paul originally wrote? Yes, like 99.9%. Identical. And so it's not like the truth is missing and we can't figure it out, even though some people will try and make it seem like that's the case. That's totally not true at all. But by the very nature of the fact that I'm reading it in English, I am not reading the words that were originally written. I'm reading the ideas. I'm having God's ideas communicated to me in a language that I understand. And that's the beautiful thing about the Bible, is because it is a written work, we can put it in any language. And we can give it to everybody. All right? If there was a special language that you had to learn, then before anybody could understand the Bible, they would have to go learn Greek.
Or Latin.
Or Hebrew, right. Aramaic, Chaldean, because those are in there too.
That would be a nightmare.
It would be awful.
Especially since some of those languages aren't really spoken as
They're not
much.
spoken, right. And so it's the beautiful thing about the Bible is that because it is a written work, it functions like a written work. That doesn't mean it's just a book, right? But by its nature, all of the good things about a book, all the good features of a written work are present in the Bible, right? And so that's important. All right, any other things to add?
Nope.
Any other thoughts? Okay, so we've been talking about inspiration and humor. If there's anything that's not clear, if you have any questions, please make sure and let us know what those are. We would love to address them. If there's something that needs to be clarified, let us know. We'd be happy to do that. But every week, what we do is we get here and we're interested in truth. We seek for truth. So we answer questions about religion, spirituality, the scriptures, philosophy, theology, all of those things. Anything that pertains to truth, that's what we're looking for. And so we're going to go ahead and close out tonight. God bless you, and thank you for joining us, and I hope it's been helpful. And thank you
Thank you.
for being here with me. I really appreciate it. All right, we'll see you guys next week.